Hey, what's up, folks? Welcome back to On Texas Football. Welcome to our way too early season preview for the Longhorns. This week, we're working on the Kentucky Wildcats, second to last game of the season, which means we're getting close to the actual season. But I'm lifetime Longhorn Rod Babers, joined by the young phenom, lifetime Longhorn CJ Vogel, joining me to help break down the Kentucky Wildcats. And CJ, first of all, I'm very excited because that means we're getting closer to the season because we're almost at the end of our season, way too early season previews here. But Kentucky is really interesting. And I don't know if you're thinking about trap games, if you know what your definition of a trap game is, all that kind of stuff. But I will say that Kentucky, at least where they fit in the schedule, they do have a nice trap game like feel to them.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Okay, so I'm glad we're on the same page here because first of all, they're right before the Aggies. And there's a very good chance that Texas could be distracted by everything going on with the rekindling of that rivalry, number one. But Kentucky's actually underrated, in my opinion. I think they're a little underrated, especially we'll talk about the defense and the offense, but let's talk about first of all, just overall as a team. The FPI. FPI has them 34th overall, the team in the country, Football Power Index by ESPN. The SP Plus by Bill Connolly has them 25th, actually. And the only 4 teams on Texas' schedule are better in terms of the overall SP Plus than where Kentucky is ranked, and that would be Georgia number 1, Michigan number 6, Oklahoma's A&M's 13, Oklahoma's 15, and then there's the Kentucky Wildcats, right? Kind of leading up to that trap game feel. They return, and this comes from Bill Connolly's returning production index, so it's a cumulative stat. They return, based on Bill Connolly's stats, 72% of their production. That leads the SEC. According to Bill Connolly. That's the top in the SEC, most returning production. He has them number 14 in the country overall, but the most in the SEC. And how about this? In terms of returning starters, they have, if it all projects, tied with Georgia for the most returning starters in the SEC with 15 returning starters. Texas has like 10 returning starters, just to give you a little context of it. They only have, and I was shocked, I had to go look this up, 4 road games. They just have 4 true road games. I don't even know how that works out. That's very strange. I don't even know how that even happens. But when I looked at it, all of their games are in Lexington, Kentucky, except for when they travel to Austin, of course, to play the Longhorns. They have to go to Knoxville. That's another one. They got to go to Gainesville to play Florida. Like I said, they got to go play Tennessee. They got to play Ole Miss at Oxford, and then that's it. That's it. The rest of their games are at home. I don't know how that happens. I don't know how that's a thing. I don't even know. Somebody's got to explain that to me, but that's weird. But so my money is Kentucky. They could be a sleeper team in the SEC if they overachieve, but their schedule is favorable just because they only got 4 true road games, and they return a lot of production, man. A lot of returning starters in production.
Yeah, they do. And, when you look at Kentucky, you know what kind of football team you're going to get. The physicality, the kind of persona that they have. It's going to be tough-nosed football in the front 7 offensively with that offensive line, and also on the defensive side of the ball in that front 7 there. The big question mark is, one, quarterback, right? Devin Leary departs. He was a big piece, but I know we talk about running the football a lot. They have 2 really talented wide receivers, Rod, that I'm really eager to see how they pan out early in the season to see what kind of issues they may present for Texas. But that's a very difficult, tough-nosed football team. I'll go back to that for a second, right? 2023 wasn't the season that they wanted on the wins and losses, right? I believe they were 7-6. They lost to Clemson by 3 in the Citrus Bowl. But the week before that, they play Kentucky, top 20 team in the country. They lose by 7. So that gives you an idea of how close they play these top teams, right? Top 20 teams in the entire country. They lose by a combined 10 points. So they're going to play Texas tough. And I think their style presents a bit of an issue there as well. And I mentioned Devin Leary departs. They have 2 really talented wide receivers. Yep. But it's more that running game that I'm looking at right now. And how do they get that thing going against Texas, which we're still kind of figuring out what those pieces are going to be for the Longhorns, right? What does that defensive line look like? How do they, kind of match up with a Michigan or a Georgia, at least, by week 12, essentially week 13, that deep in the season, Texas will have an idea of what that defensive line room will look like and how they'll be able to match up against a tough-nosed football team like Kentucky. But to your point, it's absolutely a trap game spot, right? Texas will be coming off of the road against from Fayetteville. They'll be back home. But all eyes, all headlines, everything will be looking ahead to Texas A&M in that first matchup back. So it's a tough spot. I've said it since the schedule was released. This is the game I look at and say, yeah, that's a scary spot. You know, Texas can go to Fayetteville. We know what that is.
Yep.
But for Kentucky to come to Austin in between Arkansas and Texas A&M, that's a tough spot for me. That's the toughest spot on the schedule in my eyes.
Yeah, no, I think you're right about that. And I love what you said about the physical style they do have, because they're getting a reputation for a certain brand of football. And when you've had the same coach for a while, you can develop a brand of football and identity. And that's what they've done to Mark Stoops. And it's been really interesting because let's talk about their running game before we get into the quarterback, because I'm with you. Their wide receiving core is really interesting and compelling, a little scary. But the running game overall, and they lost Ray Davis, who was at over 1,100 yards rushing last year. Really, really good player for them. But their running game has had a nice identity because they at one point they brought in 2021, they brought in Liam Cohen, who was from that Sean McVay coaching tree. And they started running a lot of that outside zone, a lot of that wide zone, those wide zone concepts. And their running game thrived. But the strange thing about Liam Cohen's time at Kentucky, he basically was there for 2 years, but not consecutively. He was there in 2021, left in 2022, went back to the Rams, and then came back in 2023. And now is with Dave Canales, who was the new head coach there in Tampa Bay, and now he's their offensive coordinator. So in between that, he went back to Sean McVay. He was with Sean McVay from like 2018 to 2020 as a position coach, and then went back to be his offensive coordinator because everybody wants the Sean McVay stamp of approval. It's really good for your resume. And so what happened to the running game in Kentucky, though, is really interesting during that time span, CJ. So how about this? Kentucky's rushing metrics in the last 3 years. And keep in mind, Liam Cohen is there 21 and 23, and he skips I think Rich Scangarello, who is now, I believe he's with the Raiders, if I'm not mistaken, NFL guy. Yes, he's their quarterbacks coach for the Raiders. He was the offensive coordinator in 2022. He was with the San Francisco 49ers as the quarterback coach there in 2021. So they obviously are looking to the NFL. They want some NFL concepts in their run game. But here are the stats. So in 2022 with Liam Cohen, in 2021 with Liam Cohen, 5.2 yards per rush. No Cohen, 3.3 in 2022. Cohen comes back, 4.9 yards per rush. That's a trend. Rushing TDs per game in 2021, 2.1, 2022, 0.7, 2023, 1.4. The Cohen effect. Yards before contact per rush in 2021 with Liam Cohen, 2.4. Without Liam Cohen in 2022, drops to 1.2. Cohen comes back, 2.0 in 2023. Explosive rush rate, 16.5 in 2021 with Cohen, drops off a cliff to 10.8% in 2022 without Cohen. Cohen comes back 16.2% in 2023.
I see the trend.
You see the trend, right? It's pretty obvious. The only stat that was a sticky stat. Sticky stats mean that the stat is consistent even when you change, say you change leagues or you change levels of football, you change coaches, the stat sticks, right? They call it a sticky stat. Avoided tackle rate was the only stat that stuck. 21.5% in 2021. 22% in 2022, 21% in 2023. But that's more the running backs, as you know. That's the running backs doing their thing, once they get to the second level or once they have to avoid contact in the backfield. That's more of a running back stat. But the running game overall and the rushing metrics, it tells you Liam Cohen made a huge difference, and he's no longer there. They hired a new OC, Bush Harndam, I believe it's his name. I'm sure I probably screwed that up, and I apologize if I did. But he's from Boise State, I believe. So they hired a new offensive coordinator, and that's going to play a huge role, CJ, in the identity of that running game. Sorry, Bush Hamdan. I apologize. Hamdan, Hamdan. I apologize for messing up. It's Hamdan. My writing is terrible, so I can't even read my own. It's not even legible. I can't even read my own handwriting. But it's Hamdan. He's the new offensive coordinator, and I do worry that the running game is just not going to be as potent if you're a Kentucky fan as it once was.
Yeah, I wonder with Kentucky, when you look at the makeup of that team, right? It's Brock Vandagriff, former 5-star recruit, quarterback from Georgia, transfers in. I think they're going to want to showcase him a little bit, right? They've had talented quarterbacks in the past, right? Will Levis, Devin Leary, really good college quarterback. This is the next in line. What's going to be interesting is how they use that running game. And I look at their running back Chip Trayanum from Ohio State. It's going to be kind of their main feature back in my eyes, right? He's a fourth-year guy. He'll be entering his fifth season. He has 4 years of experience at Ohio State. Never really broke out, right? Only averages anywhere from 4.4 to 5.1 yards per carry each season. What's interesting, though, Rod, is he's 5'11", 227, 230 probably. It's a big back. And again, when you start dealing with some of the Kentucky physicality and some of the ideas in which we believe Kentucky will use their offense, well, late in games, if Kentucky has a lead, you're not going to see much Brock Vandagriff. You're not going to see Jamori Macklin, the very talented wide receiver out of North Texas that transferred over. You're not going to see one of the top wide receivers in all of the country, Barian Brown, but you're going to see that running game. Mm-hmm. And I think that they're going to rely on guys like Gerald Mincey, the tackle transfer from Tennessee, really talented prospect as well, to get that game going, to take off some of that clock and to hold on to the time of possession and the football. And that's a situation in which Texas cannot enter a third or a fourth quarter deep into that game against Kentucky behind. Because I saw what Texas did against Alabama, right? They ran off 7 minutes of clock. I think if Kentucky has that opportunity, they're going to be able to do just the exact same thing, because that's what they do, right? That's the Michigan philosophy of, hey, we've got all sorts of talent. We got our offensive line. We got our running game. We're going to play our style of football. Kentucky's very much the same. So they're going to have the opportunity to come back if they're behind. Obviously, 2 very talented wide receivers. But their idea of football is, let's get up early, let's stay up, and let's run the clock out. And I think that's what they're going to do behind Trip Trayanum. That's going to be a really interesting game in which Texas has to get up early at halftime. They're going to have to sustain that lead in the third quarter, and they're going to have to keep playing that game of possessions. The more possessions, the better for Texas. If they let that game shorten down a little bit, Kentucky's going to have an opportunity to steal one. I'll go through some quick numbers. 29.2 points per game. That was 50th in the country a year ago, Rod. Oddly, they were around the 100th in the country in yards per game. So more points than yards, almost, a 50th to 100th. You can do the math there. 333 yards per game. So they were scoring much more than their total offense would suggest, which means they're an opportunistic defense in my eyes. They were the plus turnover margin defensively versus their offense. So worth mentioning there in terms of the style, again, in which they play defensively.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. It's very about complementary football is obviously an emphasis for Coach Stoops there, because this time they're going to have arguably their best wide receiving core they've had in years. We'll talk Barian Brown at wide receiver. I'll just give you a stat about how fast this guy is and talking about how explosive he is. He was clocked by Real Analytics at 22.6 miles per hour last year. Xavier Worthy was the top clocked ball carrier in college football last season by Real Analytics at 22.7 miles per hour. So he can go. I mean, he really can. 166 career targets. He's out wide, close to 70% of the time. 13.3 average depth of target for Barian Brown in his career. That's top 5 in this receiving class. So they use that speed to get downfield. I love the transfer they got in as well from North Texas, Jamori Macklin.
That kid's a baller, Rod.
Whoa. I didn't realize it either. I was like, I don't even know what this is. I went and did some research. Dude can play. He's one of, how about this little stat? He's one of 20 wide receivers that posted an ADOT of at least 15 yards and a yards after the catch per reception of at least 6 yards. Man, he's, like I said, half of his receiving production came on deep targets last season. That guy is, I think, going to be trouble potentially. I don't know where they're going to move him and where they put him. And then they got Dane Key. I love his size. He's 6'3". Yeah. He was second on the team in receiving yards as a freshman, 519. He led the team in receiving yards last year with 636 and 6 touchdowns on 42 receptions, 12.9, almost 13 average depth of target. He's out wide close to 90% of the time, so they just trust him to win out there. 103 passer rating when targeted. This wide receiving core, Don't let them lull you to sleep with the running game. But this wide receiving core, I think, is going to be able to win some one-on-ones. If Vandegrift actually can live up to his 5-star billing coming out of high school, and I know he does not a large sample size of what he can do, but 20 dropbacks last year, 18 attempts, 2 big-time throws, 0 turnover-worthy throws, 9.2 yards per attempt. He's going to have some weapons. And they do return 4 of the 5 starters on the offensive line. They want a great elite run-blocking offensive line overall, or elite offensive line period. They do return 4 starters, including the starting center, who should be a standout, Eli Cox, I believe is his name, and then Marquez Cox at left tackle.
Yeah, well, the interesting thing, and I'll keep this short so we can get over to the defense here, Rob, but you have Brock Vandegrift, right? We know what he was coming out of high school. He was a 5-star guy. You have all these wide receivers. Yet out of the spring, Kentucky still goes out and they add Gavin Wimsatt, the starting quarterback at Rutgers. And what does that tell me? Well, if you have a 5-star quarterback and you have all these weapons, but you're still looking for another Power 5 starting quarterback, maybe that's not the confidence that you thought you had going into the season out of spring, right? That addition happened in June. So Gavin Wimsatt started, I believe, 11 games for Rutgers in 2023. That's a guy with experience. He can push that quarterback room pretty hard, I would say. That's interesting. I thought the timing of that was pretty peculiar there in the sense that they went through the entire spring and still added a quarterback to that room of starting P4 experience. I don't know how much confidence they have in Vandegrift. Maybe they have all the confidence in the world, but that, again, it may be a little head scratching. I'll have that.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I didn't realize that, but you're right. Bringing in another guy like that, maybe they're just an insurance policy, or maybe they don't really like to see. And they know they got a good wide receiving core, though. They're like, man, we don't need an elite quarterback. We just need a guy that can put the ball on the money and give these guys a chance, because this wide receiving core has a chance to be special this year, potentially for Kentucky. All right, jumping to the defensive side of the ball. This defense actually, I think, has some special players. Starts with Deion Walker up front, CJ. And I'm sure yeah, he's a monster, man. 6'6", damn near 350. Pro Football Focus has him as one of the best D tackles, interior D linemen in the country. 51 total pressures, by the way, that led all interior defensive linemen in college football. 7.5 sacks. That would have put him tied, I believe, for the most among interior defensive linemen in college football. Dude is legit. 12 and a half tackles for loss, 29 defensive stops. The projections are he's going to be a first-round pick. He is the centerpiece of that defense. He's a matchup nightmare. And even as a freshman, I mean, this guy's I got his numbers as a freshman. He had 40 tackles, 1 sack, 4 tackles for loss, 2 passes defended, 1 forced fumble as a true freshman. So there's been a buzz about this dude for a long time, but he had his breakout year in 2023, and now the NFL scouts are salivating over this young man. Has all the metrics and measurables to be a first-round pick.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I know this doesn't mean a whole lot, Rod, but when you see him walking the halls at SEC Media Days, he looks a little different than everybody else that we saw walk through those same radio rows, those interviews, whatever. He is as physically impressive as anybody that I saw that entire weekend in Dallas. So he can go. That's probably the best player on Kentucky's defense. Yeah. What's going to be interesting is Dumas Johnson, the linebacker that they added from Georgia as well. It's kind of interesting how Kentucky gets all of their top talent, right? They do a great job out of the portal, but they get some talent from Georgia. Some guys that maybe weren't seeing the field a whole lot. Brock Vandegrift, one of them. Jason Dumas Johnson, was another one. That linebacker, very talented, expected to be a focal point in the middle of that defense as well. I'll be interested to see how they mesh early, right? We know what their MO is. They're physical. They like playing hard-nosed football. They only allowed about 25 points a game a year ago. So, again, right outside of that top 60 in the country, I would say that they played much tougher than their kind of statistical numbers show. Again, playing Kentucky and Clemson at the end of the season as close as they did shows that kind of physicality in my eyes. Those two pieces, Dumas Johnson and Deion Walker, that's going to be their entire focal point. Yep. In terms of stopping the run, playing physical up front. That front seven is going to be talented. But, Rod, they also got some pretty talented secondary members as well.
Yeah, they do. I think it starts for him. It's the cornerback, Maxwell Hairston. He's legit. He's going to play on Sundays. He'll be drafted.
That's a first small SEC player right there. Maxwell Hairston, cornerback.
Yep.
go watch his highlights if you haven't heard of him. That kid can play some football. Really talented piece.
I think I'm with you. I think he has a chance to be first team all SEC next season. Those 5 interceptions led the team. He's a real deal. But they also, I think their back 7 isn't bad either. Now the front, we talked about the defensive line. Some other guys to keep your eye on. They got a couple of really good interior defensive linemen in addition to Deion Walker. Keep your eye on Josiah Hayes. 6'3", 317. He's a nose tackle. Also, Keyshawn Silver, they rotate him in at nose tackle. So they got some pieces on the defensive front. And then you go look at their linebacking core. You brought up Dumas Johnson from Georgia, and he was great. I mean, and he didn't start necessarily for Georgia, but he was a rotational piece, and that's tough to do at Georgia, guys. He had a defensive stop on like 6% of his snaps. He did have, I believe, an injury that I think a fractured forearm that he missed the final 5 games of the season for Georgia. But other than that, he was a really productive player. But then there's a guy, J.J. Weaver, an outside linebacker for them, had 7 sacks last season. Really good player for them. Leader, guy who projects to be a captain for them. Don't forget about De'Aric Jackson. He's another good linebacker for them as well. A guy who also, Pro Football Focus, I think, had him as an all-SEC defender on their preseason team. He's a really good player. So their linebacking core has some veteran pieces. They brought in more with Dumas Johnson. I like the linebacking core a lot. And like I said, the defensive backs, Maxwell Harrison is where it starts. But they got some other pieces. The safety, Jordan Leavitt. He had 3 interceptions last year. He was a really good player for him. This Kentucky defense, at every level, when you're talking about D-line or linebacker or in the secondary, they got a player potentially that can be all SEC.
Yeah. Again, at each level, Deion Walker, Jamon Dumas Johnson, you mentioned, the other nose tackle at 320 pounds, Maxwell Harrison, DJ Waller, transfer from Michigan, a guy in which they can say, hey, we got our Manny Muhammad on one side, and we got another really talented piece over on the other side to complement that. At all phases, Rod, I really like what they've got in their defensive side of the ball. Again, what's going to be interesting is playing Kentucky that late in the year. Is Brock Vandagriff in a rhythm? How much physicality he has worn on not just Texas, but Kentucky, right? We talked about their style of play. That'll be interesting. But at each level, they have a guy that could compete or, certainly be in considerable conversations for an all-SEC honor at the end of the season. They're really talented. It's going to be, if it's not Oklahoma and Georgia back-to-back on the Texas schedule, this is without question the toughest game that Texas will face in terms of this schedule, in terms of when they play. Again, it's going to be a tough game. They're very talented. This isn't an Iowa State. I know Iowa State's given Texas troubles. Kentucky has much more talent than an Iowa State, and it's still going to be viewed as kind of that caliber of game, if you will.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, they had one of the top rush defenses in the SEC last season, and I think the front will be just as good, if not better, for them. And like I said, this is a team that if they get certain pieces to overachieve, quarterback being number one, I think that wide receiving core could thrive. That could open up the running game even more for them. And like you said, on defense, they're an opportunistic bunch, and they can stop the run, force you to throw the football, and Deion Walker, that's when he goes to work. And by the way, Dumas Johnson, little underrated stat, you don't want to get to the point where they stop the run and force you to have to throw the football, because then Dumas Johnson, 24% pressure rate, which is one of the top rates among SEC linebackers, can also get after the quarterback. So last season, when they were able to stop the run, they held 7 teams to under 100 yards rushing, and they won 6 of those games. And I think South Carolina was the only one they didn't. And that was because they were -3 in the turnover margin. And they were I believe you're going to look at it, they were 1-5 when they allowed a team to rush for more than 100 yards. And their one win was versus Louisville, who they beat 2 years in a row, and that's a rivalry game. And they were +2 in turnover margin, getting back to your point about turnover margin and how this defense can make a huge difference for them. So if it's not going to be the rush defense that determines if Kentucky's going to be in a game and win a game, it's usually turnover margin after that for them. So getting back to your original point, Texas got to make sure they win the lines of scrimmage, the running game versus Kentucky. I mean, you ready to run the ball successfully and stop the run. And then after that, I think it's turnover margin. Don't against this group because they got playmakers at every level of that defense, guys who are really opportunistic. So Kentucky, it's a trap game, and depending on the health of either team by that point and the focus, that could end up being a real challenge for Texas in Austin right before that Texas A&M game. So there you go. That's a little break. Oh, by the way, here's some specialists. By the way, if it comes down to a field goal, that ain't good for Texas either. You know, Bert Auburn, he's the man. They also got a really good field goal kicker, Alex Rayner, who was 10 of 11 on field goals a season ago, including 5 of 6 on 40-plus yard field goals. Ooh. So he actually, he's pretty damn good. And also, Barian Brown is one of the best kickoff returns. I told you he had a speed clocked at close to what Xavier Worthy was clocked at last year, 22.6 miles per hour. Xavier Worthy was 22.7. So they got a return man that's got elite kind of world-class speed. And that dude, the Wildcats, but with this, Brown will return kicks for him again this season. He had 3 kickoff returns for touchdowns in 2023. Yeah, he led college football with 3. So they got to go.
There were rumors when Barian Brown was potentially toying around with the portal. Had he entered, Texas would have gone all in for him without question because he fits Sarkisian's system of speedy, big play, electric playmaker.
Yep.
And you see why. Return game, wide receiver. He's one of the best wide receivers Texas will play all year.
Yeah, you got to worry about that dude. He's a problem. All right, they actually underrated CJ. They got one of the best wide receiving cores Texas is going to face. You're right, all season long. Like I think, honestly, it might be like top 3 or 4 that Texas will face next season. All right, good stuff there, CJ, as always, breaking down the Kentucky Wildcats. Next week, we're talking about the Aggies, folks. Yeah, we're ending our way too early season breakdown, and after that, we'll start breaking down the actual game week opponent for the Longhorns. Can't wait for that. All right, CJ, thanks for everything you do, brother. Appreciate the knowledge. For all you guys listening, thank you guys for joining us. Thank you guys for listening, and for the On Texas Football family. Until next time, hook 'em horns.